People who hurt others in self-defense. What happened? Story 1. I was being jumped by 4 guys. It happened so fast, a whirlwind of fists and shouts, and before I even understood what was happening, one of them stabbed me in the side. I felt the blade tear into me, sharp at first, then dull as the adrenaline kicked in. My mind raced, instincts took over, and I lashed out. In the chaos, I managed to thrust my own knife into one of their sides. I didn't aim. I just reacted. My blade sank deep into him, and the fight was suddenly over. The other 3 scattered, leaving their friend sprawled on the pavement, clutching his side, gasping for air. I slumped against a fence, pressing my hand to my wound, feeling the warmth of my own blood seeping through my fingers. My chest heaved as I struggled to breathe, and my vision blurred with tears. I sat there, helpless, listening to the wet, rasping sounds of his breaths growing fainter. I sobbed until the flashing lights of the police and ambulance lit up the night. The paramedics rushed to both of us, but it was too late for him. He was pronounced dead on arrival. I was taken to the hospital first. I barely remember the ride. Everything was a haze of bright lights and sterile smells, of pain and panic. They stitched me up, treated my wounds, and asked questions I wasn't ready to answer. From the hospital, I was taken straight to the station, where the questions didn't stop. I was only a minor, so my parents were called in, but that didn't make the experience any less terrifying. They asked me to recount everything, every second of the fight, every movement, every thought. I kept replaying it in my head, trying to make sense of it. Had I done something wrong? Could I have stopped it without killing him? The detectives didn't tell me much. They just listened, nodded, and left me alone in that cold room for what felt like hours at a time. Eventually, I was charged but held until the trial. The wait was agonizing. I spent weeks in juvenile detention, surrounded by other kids whose crimes and stories varied, but none of them seemed to feel as hollow as I did. I wasn't angry or defiant like some of them. I was just empty, playing that night over and over in my head. I barely slept, and when I did, the nightmares started. At the trial, the evidence was clear. The security footage showed them attacking me first. Witnesses testified to their aggression, their shouts and threats. My injuries were undeniable, and my reaction, though lethal, was deemed self-defense. The court cleared me of the charges, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a weight I would carry forever. The judge mandated therapy, not as punishment, but as a way to help me process everything. At first, I resisted it. I didn't want to talk about that night. I didn't want to close my eyes and see his face again, hear the sounds of his struggling breaths, or feel the knife in my hand. But the nightmares didn't give me a choice. They came almost every night, vivid, suffocating, and relentless. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, heart racing, gasping for air just like he had. Therapy became less of a requirement and more of a lifeline. It took months before I could even start talking about what had happened. My therapist was patient, never pushing too hard, but always guiding me to confront the parts one wanted to bury. I learned about trauma, about the ways the brain tries to protect itself, and how sometimes it fails. I learned techniques to ground myself, to break out of the panic attacks, to face the memories without letting them consume me. But it wasn't a quick fix. The nightmares lingered for years, tapering off slowly until they became less frequent. Story 2. I posted this about 10 years ago. I killed a guy that tried to break into my apartment because he was wanting his wife that he had just beat the shit out of. 2 a.m., I hear them arguing. I could hear it through my bathroom wall. I shut my bathroom then bedroom to drown it out. 2:15 a.m., she's banging on my door, broken nose, left eye swollen, and limping from tripping and falling to get out of the apartment. Told her to go to the bathroom, clean herself up, then hide in my bedroom. Husband comes out of the apartment, yelling her name, and he notices her blood trail to my apartment. Starts banging on my door, yelling to let him in. I warned him 3 times that he doesn't stop, I will kill you. He kicks the lock on the door swings open, and I swing my baseball bat down onto his head. He falls to the ground stunned. He lands stomach first, and I see a handgun tucked into the back of his shirt. I grab it, throw it into my apartment, and warned him one more time. He got up, came at me. I slammed my bat into his stomach, then slammed my bat over his head one last time, which caved his skull in. I knew from the blood spatter from when I hit, he was dead. Thankfully, the neighbors had called the police when it started, and the second he fell to the ground dead, police had made it to the top of the steps. Everyone that was awake came out, gave their statements. Police talked to the wife in my bedroom. She told the police that she wasn't leaving that room, so they could take her statement there. I gave my statement, handed over my bat, showed them the gun which was registered to him. Called in to work that day. Story 3. Woken up in the middle of the night by banging on the front door. Security camera showed a man kicking at the door and carrying an axe which he would occasionally swing at the door/handle. We called the police and they were en route. With 911 on the phone on speaker, I got my shotgun and yelled to the man that he needed to leave and that we were armed. Partners stayed with the kids in their bedroom. I shouted several times that he needed to leave and that I would shoot him. He kept kicking the door. He finally broke the door enough to get through. I leveled the gun and shouted again, and he came at me and I fired. 0 buckshot in the upper chest. I kicked the axe away and kept the gun pointed at him. The police arrived less than 30 seconds after, and I put the shotgun down with my hands up. The police officer took my shotgun, handcuffed and rendered aid to the man, but he was already dead. I'm assuming they, the police, still have to try. The police took a statement and I emailed the video, front porch and inside, to the detective. A few days later we got a call from the police that the family of the man wanted to talk to me, and the detective said he thought I should. They were very kind and apologized for their son's actions. They offered to pay for the door he kicked in and any other damage to the house. The father was very quiet, but had a kind expression. The mother did most of the talking and explained that their son had gotten involved in drugs, and they lost him a year ago. They both apologized many times and offered to help. I explained that our homeowner's insurance was covering the door. It was an antique mahogany door with stained glass and damage to the house. We sold the house shortly after. Kids and us were not comfortable living thereafter, and moved across town. Every year since we have gotten a Christmas card from the parents. Story 4. My co-worker's dad was a jewelry salesman. He went on a sales call with some high-end pieces, traveling with the kind of merchandise that could make him a target. When he was leaving the meeting, a guy ambushed him in the parking lot and shot him. The bullet hit hard, knocking him to the ground behind his car. Pain and panic surged through him, but he managed to keep his wits. As one of the attackers ran up to finish the job, he pulled out his own gun and fired. The shot hit its mark. The other guy froze for a moment, then bolted, leaving his partner behind. My co-worker's dad survived. He made it through surgery and months of recovery, but the mental scars stayed longer than the physical ones. He couldn't walk through parking lots without checking his surroundings, couldn't help but flinch at loud noises. The fear lingered, a constant shadow, even after he knew both attackers were caught, tried, and ended up in prison. Justice was served, but the experience left a mark on everyone involved. It was the kind of incident that made you realize how fast life could turn violent, how thin the barrier was between safety and danger. A friend in college had a kid with an absolute shitbag of a guy. She couldn't save him. He spiraled further and further out of control even after they broke up. When she finally left him and moved back in with her parents, he didn't take it well. Obsession turned to harassment, and he got arrested a few times for stalking her. Restraining orders didn't stop him. He kept finding ways to worm himself back into her life, to make her feel unsafe. She lived on edge, double-checking locks and jumping at shadows. One day, he completely snapped. He showed up at her parents' house, wild and furious, and started shooting. It was a nightmare. Her mom and she had gone to the store, but her dad was home, out in the barn. He heard the shots and grabbed his rifle. Years of working the land, hunting, and protecting his family came down to that one moment. When the guy tried to force his way inside, her dad fired. One shot, and it was over. The guy wasn't missed. No one shed a tear for him. Story 5. Not me, but I was on the scene. I'm a music video director in Los Angeles. We were shooting a music video scene in Compton, a typical day, or so it seemed. The crew was buzzing, setting up lights and cameras, and the artist was getting into the zone. We'd locked down permits and followed all the usual protocols, but anyone who's worked in this industry knows that paper doesn't always mean protection. It started with a couple of guys rolling up, eyeing the set. At first, it just looked like curiosity, maybe some locals wanting to check out the shoot. But then the energy shifted. They weren't just watching, they were sizing us up. Words were exchanged. The air grew heavier. One of the guys stepped forward, acting like he owned the block, which, in some ways, he probably thought he did. He demanded payment, said we were filming in his hood and needed to pay rent if we wanted to keep going. We tried to defuse it, keep things calm. The last thing anyone wanted was trouble, especially with all the gear, the lights, and the talent standing around. But it escalated fast. Voices rose. Crew members started backing up. The guy pulled a gun, just like that. No warning, no hesitation. He waved it around, demanding cash, jewelry, anything he could get. People froze. Some ducked behind equipment. Others just stood there, too shocked to move. That's when our personal security stepped in. He didn't waste time. Pulled out his gun, steady and sure. The whole thing happened in seconds, but felt like it stretched out forever. One shot, and the guy dropped. Right there, in front of everyone. The silence afterward was deafening. No one moved at first. The other guys who'd rolled up with him bolted, leaving their friend bleeding out on the pavement. The crew was in shock, some crying, some shaking, others just staring. It was a bittersweet moment for sure. On one hand, security did what he was hired to do, protect us. On the other hand, someone was dead, and that reality hit hard. The police showed up within minutes. Someone must have called as soon as they heard the shot. They swarmed the area, questioning everyone, taping off the scene. It felt surreal, standing there trying to explain what had happened while the body was still lying there. Security was taken into custody for questioning, though it was clear he acted in self-defense. Still, the process wasn't quick or easy. We packed up the set while the investigation unfolded, but no one was thinking about the shoot anymore. Conversations were hushed, eyes were wide, and everyone kept glancing over their shoulders. It's one thing to hear about violence like this, to see it in movies or the news. It's another to be there, to feel the weight of it in the air. The aftermath dragged on. Statements, follow-ups, legal reviews. It all blended into one long, stressful blur. Eventually, security was cleared. Self-defense, they ruled. But even with the legal side wrapped up, the emotional impact lingered. Some of the crew didn't come back for future shoots. A few quit the industry entirely. Others stuck around, but were changed, more guarded, more cautious. Story 6. This isn't my story, but it's one that has stuck with me ever since I heard it. It's about someone I know, an elderly woman, a grandma, whose life was turned completely upside down in ways no one could have predicted. It's a story that feels more like something out of a crime drama than real life, but it's heartbreakingly true. This grandma had what most people dream of, a happy, long-lasting marriage. Her husband was a Vietnam veteran, and the two of them were inseparable. They had built a life together, full of love and laughter, and were the kind of couple people admired. After years of marriage, they still held hands and stole kisses, and their bond was something to aspire to. But life has a way of throwing curveballs, and out of the blue, her husband fell seriously ill. It all happened so fast. One moment they were living their normal, happy life, and the next he was gone. Losing him shattered her. After decades of being part of a team, she suddenly found herself alone. The house felt emptier, the silence heavier, and the routines they once shared now seemed hollow. Grief is a strange thing. It's not just sadness, but also this aching loneliness that creeps in, especially after losing a life partner. So, when she eventually met someone new, people weren't surprised. They hoped it might help her heal, give her some companionship to ease the pain. But no one could have predicted how tragically wrong it would all go. This new man seemed fine at first. He was a former cop, a bit of a gun enthusiast, and he knew how to talk the talk. Maybe it was his confidence or the way he made her feel noticed, but whatever it was, she let him into her life. Sadly, though, it didn't take long before his true colors began to show. He was abusive, emotionally, verbally, and eventually physically. For someone who had spent her entire adult life in a loving relationship, this was foreign territory. She'd never been treated this way before, and I can only imagine how disorienting it must have been. I suspect she stayed because she was lonely. When you've known what it's like to have a person by your side for so many years, it's hard to let go of the idea of having someone there, even if that person is toxic. Then one night, everything came to a head. I only know bits and pieces of what happened, but from what I've heard, he attacked her. I can't even imagine the fear she must have felt in that moment, trapped, vulnerable, and desperate. In the chaos, she grabbed a loaded gun that he kept in the house. Being a former cop, he apparently had quite a few firearms lying around, and shot him. She killed him. His adult son, who was in his 40s, was home at the time, playing video games in another room. After the shooting, she had to go and tell him what had just happened. I can't even wrap my head around how surreal and horrifying that must have been for everyone involved. Together, they called the police, and she was arrested on the spot. The story made the local news almost immediately. Her name and mugshot were plastered everywhere, labeled as a murderer. An 80-year-old grandmother locked up in jail, accused of murder. People who didn't know her or the details of what happened formed their own opinions, as people often do. The internet doesn't forget, and even today, her name is forever associated with that headline. She spent several days in jail before she was released, but the nightmare didn't end there. The case is still technically open. She's been told that the investigation is ongoing and could remain that way for years. It's a constant weight hanging over her, a reminder that at any moment, detectives could show up, interview her friends and family, or decide to press charges. Her lawyers warned her to keep quiet about what happened. Don't talk to anyone, not her kids, not her friends, not even a therapist. She's been told that any little thing she says could be twisted and used against her. So she carries this burden silently, unable to fully process what happened or find closure. The isolation that followed has only deepened her trauma. She lost her husband, then she lost her sense of safety, and now she lives with the fear that this incident will follow her for the rest of her life. Therapy, which could have been a lifeline, is off limits. Support from loved ones is limited because she can't share the full story. Instead, she's left to replay the events over and over in her mind, haunted by what she did and what might still come. The saddest part is how drastically her life changed in such a short span of time. In less than 2 years, she went from a blissful, happy marriage to being widowed, abused, and arrested for murder. She didn't ask for any of it, and yet she's the one living with the consequences. What makes it even worse is that the internet keeps the story alive. Anyone who Googles her name will see the headline about her being arrested for murder, but won't see the context, the abuse, the fear, the desperation. Story 7. I was working out of town and staying at a high-end establishment, the Super 8 motel company booked. I had just got off work and got back to the room, so I dropped my gear and walked across the street to a 7-Eleven. As I walked over, I noticed a woman sitting around the side of 711, crying and cradling what looked like a baby. She was alone and sobbing. I walked her way, and when I was maybe 15 feet away, I just said, "Ma'am, are you okay?" She looked up and nodded, and me, but she was clearly distraught. Didn't look to be injured or beaten or anything. I asked if she needed anything, and she looked up at me, but as soon as she looked my way, her eyes looked to my right, and I turned to look and see a man running full speed at me. Before I could even react, he raised his fist to hit me while running full speed. I turn away, and he just kinda runs into me. He starts wilding, swinging at me, but nothing is really connecting. He's fighting more like a child, just swinging everywhere. I'm backing up, circling around, dodging him, doing everything to avoid him and not engage him. He comes at me one more time, and I'm able to grab him by both shoulders and use his own momentum to throw him past me and onto the ground. He gets up and runs around the back of 711. I look around and look at the woman kinda like, what the fuck was that? She's clutching her baby tight, not saying a word, and there's no one else around who saw it. I check around the back on 711 and see nothing. So I go to walk into 711 to talk to a worker or anyone who saw anything. I was inside for maybe 5 minutes, talked to the workers, got some snacks and some beer, and went to leave. When I got around the side of the store, I turned to see if the woman was still there, and she was gone. Then, I turned to walk across the street to my motel, and I hear some footsteps running at me again from the gas pumps. I turn and see him coming straight at me. I square up to him, raise my right foot, and just flat foot kick him directly in the chest with my Irish settlers, and he dropped hard. His momentum from running, and my kick to the chest made his feet come out from under him, and he landed on his back and slammed the back of his head onto asphalt. Out cold. A couple people at the gas pump saw it and came over. I called 911 immediately. Cops showed up in about 3 minutes. Ambulance took much longer. I told the cops the entire story, and they looked at cameras from 711 and from the motel and told me it was clearly self-defense. Took my info, and I was on my way after about 45 minutes. They called me 3 days later saying the man was bleeding on his brain and most likely wouldn't make it. He was a transient, known well by the police. He had no family, no insurance, was essentially on life support. My name is still on record, but I was not charged with manslaughter or anything. Story 8. I'm not going to go into too many details because my case did reach the courts and the news, so pardon my brevity. It's still not the easiest thing to talk about, even all these years later. At the time, I was staying at my parents' place. They were out of town on vacation, and in hindsight, I thank God for that. I've thought about it often. What could have happened if they'd been home, especially given their age? It's hard to know if things might have played out differently, but at least I can carry the small comfort of knowing they weren't put through the same terror I faced that night. I was in the basement when it all started. I'd been home alone, just going about my evening, probably watching TV or tinkering with something. Honestly, the details of what I was doing before the incident have blurred over time. What sticks with me, clear as day, is the moment I realized something was wrong. I heard the sound of glass shattering upstairs. At first, I froze. It was one of those moments where your brain struggles to catch up, trying to convince yourself it's something innocuous. A tree branch, maybe, or something falling off a shelf. But deep down I knew. It wasn't just the noise, it was the feeling that came with it. That sudden, gut-level awareness that danger is near. I crept up the stairs, heart pounding, hoping I'd misheard. But when I popped out to investigate, I came face to face with the man who'd broken in. He wasn't expecting anyone to be home, and I could see the split-second shock on his face when he saw me. I screamed instinctively, hoping it might startle him enough to make him back off. It didn't. Instead, he grabbed a nearby knife, probably one he'd spotted in the kitchen, and came at me. It all happened so fast. There wasn't time to think, only to react. I'll spare the graphic details, but I regretfully ended his life in an instant. The younger one, the one I later learned was his accomplice, panicked and bolted, taking the car with him. He was caught almost a full day later. The police initially charged him with manslaughter, but the charges were later upgraded to murder. He was convicted on the original charge and served his time, eventually being released. As for me, the nightmare was far from over. I was cleared of all charges after nearly 2 years of court battles, but those 2 years were some of the hardest of my life. Even though I knew I'd acted in self-defense, the burden of having to prove it weighed heavily on me. In Canada, you're allowed to defend yourself, but you have to demonstrate that it was absolutely necessary, and that's no small task. The legal process was brutal. I only spent about 20 minutes in jail before being moved to an interview room and later released, but the damage was already done. The court proceedings dragged on for what felt like an eternity. Every step of the way, I had to relive that night, replaying the fear, the chaos, and the aftermath over and over again. It wasn't just exhausting, it was soul-crushing. And then there were the costs. By the time it was all over, my legal fees had hit $600,000. $600,000 just to prove I had the right to defend myself in my own home. It's staggering when you really think about it, and I don't know how anyone without resources would survive something like this. It makes you realize just how flawed and inaccessible the justice system can be, even when you're on the right side of it. But the financial cost paled in comparison to the emotional toll. The trauma sticks with you. It changes you. Even now, over 15 years later, it's not something I can fully forget. There's a weight to it that never completely lifts, no matter how much time passes. People often talk about the physical act of surviving an attack, but they don't always talk about the aftermath, the guilt, the self-doubt, and the endless questioning. Was it worth it? Did I make the right choice? Could I have done something differently? I still ask myself those questions sometimes, even though I know logically that I didn't have any other options. The hardest part, though, is the memory of the sound. It's something I'll never be able to erase. The sound of someone dying, even someone who meant me harm. It's not like the movies. It's raw and haunting and sticks with you in ways you can't explain to people who haven't been through it. It's awful, truly awful, and it stays lodged in your mind like a splinter that won't come out. I've come to terms with what happened, as much as anyone can. I know I did what I had to do to survive, and I'd make the same decision again if I had to. But if there ever were a next time, God forbid, I don't think I'd use a gun. Not because I regret defending myself, but because I don't think I could ever go through the aftermath again. The legal battle, the mental and emotional scars, the questioning from strangers who only know part of the story, it's just too much. Story 9. I worked as maritime security contractor in 2020 and had to defend the ship. In lockdown, my friend, former Army Ranger before being medically discharged at 23, was attending a veteran support group. He got approached by a guy looking for security guys. He was super excited. The ship was also requiring everyone be vaccinated, so that was really hurting his staffing. Normally you have to be former military personnel, but due to the desperation and a lot of complacency, they offered me a role. I'm pretty handle with a rifle and used to be an EMT. Had to do a little test to prove proficiency with a rifle, and I was hired. That I later found out at a much lower rate than everyone else, but was still getting about as much as an average person's yearly salary for a few months' work. did some training, got on the boat in the UAE, and on the way to Mombasa, we got engaged. I remember standing and seeing a spark from a ricochet and a pipe burst fluid from a round from the pirates and thinking, whoa, that was a real bullet. The idea I was being shot at was so foreign to me it took a moment to register it. I couldn't hear anything except my breathing and my heartbeat. Boats are normally very loud, as is gunfire, but I couldn't hear a thing. I came up over my sandbags, and from dumb luck, my reticle was pretty much bang on a guy. I could see the whites of his eyes. He had a blue Cookie Monster shirt on, an AK and a little skiff boat. I made a weird gasp that I had never made before or made since, flicked off the safety, pulled the trigger right over his right cheekbone. My report says I shot another guy in the boat, but I don't remember it at all. I do remember seeing the blood on the back of their boat through the scope though. I also remember bragging before going about how nothing would happen, and that if it did, I'd be fine. I wasn't, but not for the reasons I would think. My boss gave me the number of a therapist who fought in the Black Hawk Down battle, and he probably saved my life. I was so angry at the pirate for making me shoot him for something as dumb as money. Like I would have paid him to not try and hijack the boat. It made me really bitter at the world, but simultaneously made me aware of how fragile life is. I moved my finger 2 inches and 2 lives were done. Possibly decades of life and boom, over. I often think about Cookie Monster shirt guy. Was he funny? What was his name? Was he an older brother like me? What was his favorite sports team? Did he have a girl he had a crush on? A couple nights after the incident, we watched Star Wars, and there's a scene where Han and Leia are on the speeders on Endor, and they juke, and a stormtrooper chasing them crashes into a tree and dies. I absolutely bawled my eyes out over this. A scene I had watched dozens of times, over a faceless character in a movie. I sobbed and sobbed over the stormtrooper's death. My therapist helped with the killed for money thing. He asked me what I would have done if someone told me, shoot him, and you won't get paid. I said I'd still do it, because otherwise I or my crew would die. He pointed out that I didn't do it for money, but to protect my friends. Same reason he shot people in Somalia. Story 10. He didn't die, but he almost did. I was a manager at a grocery store. One of my employees was being sexually harassed by this 19-20 kid, so I asked him to leave her alone. He said he would catch me alone. Lived in a smaller/medium-sized town back then, small enough where it was easy to follow people and find out information. Back then I didn't have a vehicle, so I walked home after closing the store around 9/10 p.m. I was early 20s, and my younger brother by 2 years had a reputation. He knew people, he was the troublemaker, me the goody two-shoes. Anyways, I called my younger brother to let him know that I was kind nervous and scared, and so he made it a point to meet me and walk home with me that night. This kid comes zooming in his car and nearly runs us over, but parks on a side street as we cross the street to an elementary playground. He comes running at us, and apparently he had found out that I had a 1-year-old daughter. Starts saying he's gonna kill her and shit, so I hit him. I'm a terrible fighter, so I end up tripping over myself, and all of a sudden the kid's almost on top of me. I hear my brother yell, "Hey, I think he's got a knife, what the fuck?" So I kick up at him to stop him from what he's doing. My brother comes running full force and uppercuts this kid so hard that I heard something pop. Then the kid's pocket knife is now next to him, and he's on the ground screaming, but starting to get up and reach for the knife. So I run up and kick him in the jaw as hard as I can, and I remember seeing blood splash everywhere, and then he slumps and no noise. Me and my brother run because we are terrified and end up back at home. My brother reassured me that he deserved it, but I felt nasty and like a piece of shit. A month later I come across a GoFundMe page for kids' jaw reconstructive type surgery. Had to have it wired shut and multiple surgeries were planned to get it back in working order. The page said that he was in an accident 120/XX of that year and gave the exact date and time of our fight. I was truly shaken. I was even more bewildered that this kid never told anyone or the authorities about my brother and I. I mean, I believe we'd have had a good defense for self-defense, but I was just shocked he never even tried to come after us. I still think about it from time to time, and it makes me feel icky. Story 11. My squad was running after an armed suspect. When we caught up to him, I saw my partner run up behind him and grab his shoulder. The suspect then pulled out the gun, turned to face my partner, and began to level the gun. My memory of that moment is burned into my brain. I could clearly see the bend in his right arm. His tricep went from vertical to horizontal as he pulled the gun out. Then his tricep went from horizontal to vertical as he leveled the gun at my partner. I was about 3 yards off to the side when I heard a gunshot and saw my partner stumble back. I shot and killed the guy. The next few weeks were pretty bad. The news was all over the incident that night. The next day, it blew up on social media. A local news station interviewed the suspect's mother. I knew we wouldn't see eye to eye on the incident, but hearing her express her grief hit me hard. I took her son away from her forever. Her child. She poured all of her love and dreams into him. And in the space of seconds, he was taken by my hand. The weight of the consequences of those moments is heavy and hard to bear. A lot of voices were saying that he didn't deserve to die. But deserve had nothing to do with it. What he may or may not have deserved had no bearing on my actions. I simply did not want to die. I felt responsible for his death and for the grief of his mother. That feeling stayed with me for a while and still lingers. It took a lot of therapy and peer support, but I have now accepted that while I played a role in his death, he was ultimately responsible for his own death. He made a series of terrible decisions. Each decision forced us to act. Those decisions eventually forced us to kill him. It seems so cruel, like some kind of sick cosmic joke, that life is so easy to take away. My finger moved a half-inch, and now a mother no longer gets to see her son again. A baby will never know their father. It's fucked. Story 12. Someone that picked me up hitchhiking when I was a young teenager, 14, got me buzzing hard on beer and hash. He had multiple open cases of beer behind the seats and a fist-sized ball of hash in the center console, and then got handsy and aggressively grabbed my dick multiple times, was much bigger and stronger than me, accelerating the car so I couldn't escape. The soft part of their temple met the padlock I wore around my neck Sid Vicious style. It was hanging off my belt because the padlock was too heavy to really wear like that for long. It became an impromptu mace in the cab of his truck, and I caught him with it. We left the highway and went through the ditch into the trees and into a sudden stop. I hit my head so hard that I was knocked out for a bit. I came to and he was slumped over the wheel with a big nasty dent in his temple that was pouring blood, and he was bubbling blood from the mouth too. I freaked the fuck out and ran through the woods alongside the highway until I came to a huge cornfield. I ran through the corn until I was on the top of a small hill and could see multiple stopped vehicles and flashing lights. I heard sirens in the distance, and I panicked and kept running until I got the bright idea to stop and bury myself as best I could in all the fallen and old leaves on the ground. I stayed there not moving a muscle, expecting to hear police dogs. And then I fell asleep like that, for hours, still holding the chain and padlock when I woke up. Everything was quiet and it was dark. I was scared shitless, but I could hear the highway, the odd cars and semi-trucks passing by. I backpedaled away from where we crashed and made it to the trees alongside the highway. I plodded through the bush for a while and then peeked out. Nothing, all quiet. Got a break in cars and just walked out to the highway and stuck out my thumb. I was a young kid and looked even younger than I was, and I got a ride shortly after. We passed the spot where we crashed and I could see the tire marks, but everything else was gone. I don't know if he lived or died. Years later I tried searching the area's newspapers and news online, but couldn't find anything. So all I really know is that he got what was coming to him, and he picked the wrong kid to try and fuck that day. I tell myself that he died, and that I potentially saved other victims from that predator. I've reconciled it in myself, and it's just a distant memory now. Story 13.